Welcome to CoramBAAF Conversations, a podcast series dedicated to adoption, fostering and kinship care. We ask children's social care professionals and experts by experience to join us to share with us and you, our listeners, their experiences, reflections and knowledge. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome all, I'm Ellyse Hinder, Senior Marketing and Engagement Officer at CoramBAAF, and today I'm going to be talking with Sylvia, Ikomi and Lorna. We're going to be thinking about how social workers and teachers or those working in education can come together to help look after children and young people. Sylvia, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Sylvia, as mentioned. I have been doing a lot of research into the education attainment level of children in care since 2016, and I am currently completing my PhD study on the adultification of Black girls in state care. I am also a secondary school teacher.
Just a few hats. Thank you, Sylvia. So Lorna, lovely to have you back. You've worked with us previously. You've helped us with events and around kinship care. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Lorna. I am a researcher at Cardiff University. I do research really about anything to do with children's social care. So all the way through from kind of early support for families who have a social worker through to kind of care experienced parents and kind of what they might need to adjust to parenthood. But really my research focuses very much on the relationships that matter to children and what we can do to support those. I grew up in foster care myself, in and out of foster care throughout my childhood, and then became a foster carer, a kinship foster carer for my younger brother.
Thank you, Lorna. A lot of different experiences there. So I think because our members are social work professionals and professionals working within children's social care, we want to think about, bridging that gap between teachers, education professionals and social workers, really. So if we can start with the basics, my first question to you is, what are the biggest challenges that looked after children face in school?
I would say that biggest overriding challenge that I have observed is a lack of a trauma-informed approach by teachers.
Do you mind going into that a bit more, Sylvia? Maybe just explaining what a trauma-informed approach is for those that don't know and how that relates to teaching?
So a trauma-informed approach is an approach that means that the teacher is aware of the impact of the adverse childhood experience that the child has had. So, for example, for many children, we have academic research that shows they find themselves in the classroom thinking, am I safe? Do you like me? However, if the teacher doesn't understand that and doesn't understand their background, so they're not well informed, there can be a breakdown in communication.
Thank you. So it's about having that sort of awareness of a child individually and their background and how they can be supported. Is that right?
Yes.
I think for children who are in care, some of the biggest issues are that, quite often they have moved through quite a lot of homes. So whether it's their family home, potentially into foster care, maybe into a different foster care placement, and then back to a family home and then back into foster care. Quite often people realise that these children are moving homes, but quite often they're also moving schools. So I personally think I went to 10 or 11 different schools throughout my childhood. So that comes with a loss of friendships as well and a loss of routine. There could be lots of things going on in the background for children who are looked after, around their relationships, their home life, their worries about what's happening with their parents, their siblings. And quite often, I think one of the worries for children when they're in care and they're in the classroom is that people don't know what's happening at home. So I think just building on what Sylvia said, I think it's teachers having that understanding that, if this child isn't engaging, whatever that looks like, it might not be because the child doesn't want to engage, but because there are so many other things kind of on their mind and kind of getting in the way.
If we're thinking about how we can improve that and support children, essentially, a poor collaboration between teachers and social workers can really affect them. So I suppose strengthening that relationship would really help to sort of have a fuller picture and have support across multiple areas.
Yeah, I would say, teachers quite often are the ones that spend the most amount of time with children. So, they know what the child's like around their peers. They know, what kind of things really excite children, what engages them. Social workers, when children are in care, social workers may only see that child, once every few months. for quite a short visit. So, where teachers and social workers aren't collaborating, and, social workers aren't asking the teacher, how the child is, and the teacher isn't learning from the social worker about, that kind of trauma and those experiences and what else is going on for the child, they can really miss that opportunity as professionals to kind of learn from each other and kind of skill and kind of make the most of both professions to meet the needs of looked after children.
Maybe advice for social workers to really lean on teachers, because like you said, they're there constantly.
Absolutely. I would echo everything that Lorna has said. This is why this conversation does need to be a multi-agency conversation. Oftentimes teachers say, we're not social workers. And the point that Lorna has made, thinking about the time we spend as teachers with these children from September till June, or July, Monday to Friday, oftentimes from 8 o'clock in the playground until 3:30 every day, we have a lot of contact with them. And I think there is a responsibility to have an understanding of the children's experience and to ensure that the work that we do with them recognizes that and is considerate. So I think the mark there when it comes to I'm not a social worker, I think that is part of the gap that needs to be bridged in the conversation that is had with teachers. That we're not expecting you to be social workers. However, we cannot delegate our own responsibility to the social workers. So I think that's part of the conversation that does need to be had.
Yeah, and I think just, again, building on what Sylvia's saying, teachers aren't social workers, but they are amazing professionals in their own right. And I have, a lot of friends who are teachers who, actually come to me as a research professional in this area, but also based on my own kind of care experience and experience in school when they have looked after children, because they want to know, the best way to work with the child in their class and the best way to support them. And quite often teachers don't necessarily feel like they've got that relationship with a social worker where they could just pick up the phone and say, I think something's happened this week because this child is acting very out of character. They do, I think, want to have that resource to be able to kind of have that better collaboration with social workers.
Absolutely. I think that's growing in momentum in the work I've done, for example, with NASUWT Teachers Union. The teachers are always keen and receptive to learning more. Many of them become concerned when they hear about the situation, for example, statistically, when it comes to the rate of children in care who do go on to college or university, they're dire statistics, and they are keen. And it's just a case of what are we going to do? Where do we take these conversations?
Yeah, I would say as well that quite often school is like a real safe space for children that don't have that clear routine at home or are moving, between different households and things like that. Like school can be, the routine of school can be really, really important. And even if they're maybe pushing back against that a little bit with their behavior, school and, a good engagement with school and a teacher who's paying attention to them, like, can be absolutely transformative for looked after children.
Absolutely, Lorna. I think that's another key message for teachers, that the children always say to child welfare experts that there was the one teacher when they look back on their childhood that really believed in them. And child welfare experts are always keen for teachers to know how valued their work is and when it is done properly.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing really is it's not just about social workers leaning on teachers, it's also teachers leaning on social workers and sort of having that space for children to just be cared for, really. So we've sort of covered what effect that relationship between teachers and social workers can have for a child. Yeah, I just wondered if you had any more to say about what benefits looked after children get from better teamwork between teachers and social workers.
I'd say that there are a few benefits. One of the key benefits is that teachers have a more considerate approach. When we are managing the behaviour of the children in school, we are doing this based on a more holistic understanding of what is happening with the child in front of us. And empathy. I think it does increase empathy, and it means that the teachers are aware of the unique challenges of the children. It also means that we have a multi-agency approach. So the support they're getting is joined up. If there is a problem in the home environment, if there are concerns, those that are exhibiting themselves within the classroom and in the playground, those are escalated to the social workers. And if there are problems at home that can have an impact in school, teachers are aware. So it's not a case of one hand not knowing what the other hand is doing. I think the greatest thing for the children is that they have more comprehensive, rich support and care and consideration given towards them by the teachers.
Yeah, I would also kind of say that quite often, we talk about advocacy for children in care, like as if we bring in an advocate who's a person, separate to the social work team. But quite often, if you ask a child who a trusted person is, who could speak on their behalf at a meeting, quite often they will talk about that teacher, and it's not always, the safeguard and lead actual teacher who they feel knows them best, who can represent, who they are and what they want. So I think there's also that opportunity for teachers to be a little bit more involved in some of the decision making around children in care and helping kind of children have a voice as well.
Definitely.
I would say that the point you've made, Lorna, resonates with a scheme called the Designated Teacher Scheme, in which a specific teacher, is given the role of monitoring and making sure that they spend time every day with a child, one of the children who is in local authority care or in America state care. It has been trialled in America as well in schools. And the feedback from the research in England from the children has been the issue that you've mentioned, Lorna, where there is a view that this is the job of the teacher who is the safeguarding officer. And I think sometimes other teachers shy away and think, something might go wrong. I don't feel equipped to really take up these types of roles. But the children have complained that in that case, they end up with a teacher who teaches the subject that they hate the most and doesn't quite have a bond with them. And this is why I would recommend a whole school approach, which does move us away from thinking that everything that happens when it comes to this work centers around the teacher who is the safeguarding lead, and making sure that the children do have a voice. If you do have a designated teacher scheme in which a teacher is touching base with them, give them a choice. Check with the teachers beforehand so they don't experience rejection. Look at the list of the teachers that they have and give them a choice as to who that teacher should be. And also open up the training. Let's not have all the knowledge centered around the safeguarding lead. Safeguarding leads are under incredible pressure in schools. So I think the point that you've made, Lorna, just really wanted to emphasize that even when things have been done, there does need to be some consideration of how these initiatives are being implemented in ways that benefit the children.
So expanding on that, if we're talking about tools and sort of changing the way that things are currently, can you share any practical tips, ways that social workers and teachers can communicate with each other, things that we can improve to make sure that we've got that connection there to sort of encompass what you've said, that we're incorporating the voice of the child, but through collaboration and that multi-agency approach that we've been talking about. Just if you can touch on what can be done to make sure teachers and social workers share information about a child's needs and progress.
There are two key areas that come to mind for me immediately. One of the areas being the point that Lorna made about how frequently contact is made. For example, if social workers have periodic catch-ups with the children, but then updates are not given to schools regularly. So I think having more regular communication, touching base more regularly with each other, and not centering the engagement around there being a problem. I think just having a more structured approach that means even if it's just a quick update whereby there hasn't been a serious incident, but we are still communicating with each other. I think there needs to be more regular communication. And I'd say that in terms of the training that we have, the material that we use in schools, the evidence base that informs our teaching, I think we do need to lean more on literature that also amplifies the voice of social workers and their perspectives on the work that we are doing with the children.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the updates part, it's so important. It seems like a little thing, but when care experienced adults access their social work files, quite often the information that's included in there is so negative. And the information about education is really just about whether or not a child went to school and what grades they got. And I think teachers have really, really rich examples of, children kind of thriving and doing things for the very first time, or, stand in front of the class and giving a presentation for the first time and things like that. And I think if some of those examples could be included in children's care files rather than just kind of really hard outcomes like what grades or, attendance figures, it would make such a difference to care experienced adults looking back on their childhood and kind of understanding what they were like as children. I think that could make a real difference to people. The other thing that I was thinking about in terms of kind of social workers and teachers kind of learning about each other, I think shared opportunities to do training together would be great. So I think even if it's professional development opportunities, conferences, things like that, where teachers and social workers can learn a little bit about what the other does and kind of demystify it, I think that could be really important, just so that it feels like an easier conversation to have, a teacher to pick up the phone to a social worker, because actually quite often teachers are very stressed. They've not got time to be kind of quickly reporting everything. But if it felt like that relationship was there, that might be, a bit of an easier thing to do. There's a project that we ran an evaluation at Cascade, quite a large project, which was about social workers being based within schools in England, and actually what difference it made that there was an actual designated social worker within a school, so that teachers could go and have those conversations face to face with a social worker when they had concerns, but also, just to share progress and updates about children who are looked after, rather than it feeling like an additional administrative task to kind of report on anything that was a problem. So I think that can make a difference as well, kind of those opportunities to kind of co-locate social workers and teachers together, or even just have opportunities to have more informal conversations.
I definitely echo what you said there, Lorna. The nature of teaching at its best, where the knowledge exchange we have as teachers, if I'm teaching a student and let's say Mondays, we all know Mondays are not a child's favourite day, but in one lesson, they were suddenly really excited because they made a turning point with one of the activities. And I would then mention this to my colleagues during break time. And also if there was any concern, but we're seeing improvement, we would exchange knowledge, talk to each other and learn from each other. So I think that knowledge exchange in our culture of working together as teachers is very natural and organic. And so the point that you've made there, Lorna, whereby it's not always very formal and very structured in a way that makes the interactions quite stiff, I think that would be helpful for teachers.
I think you've given a lot of examples there, just sort of thinking back to one of the first points you made about, there's regular updates and sharing the positive and the not so positive, just sort of giving that rounded approach that you really can track the progress and not having a negative perspective or only touching base on something negative has happened. That's one area that you've covered really nicely, I think. And then also what you touched on, Lorna, about writing about children and sort of thinking about how they're going to eventually read that information and bearing that in mind. And then the collaboration. So would you like to talk a bit more about your work at Cascade, Lorna? Just that bit of where you said about co-locating social workers and teachers. Did you say that's a model that has been tried and tested?
When we started that project quite a few years ago now, a lot of people said, well, this is what used to happen anyway. You used to have social workers that were more based within communities and localities, and they weren't kind of in a separate office away from everywhere. You would have a social worker who would be the regular social worker who would go to that school. I would say it's not a new model, but yes, we did an evaluation, which the report is freely available on the Cascade website, looking at just what difference that made in terms of that kind of shared professional working as well. So it wasn't about, whether or not this reduced the number of children who came into care or anything like that necessarily. It was more also just about how being together could kind of help both people in those professions, teachers and social workers, kind of work together in a kind of smoother way. So part of that is about addressing issues that come up in families where children aren't in care. So actually social workers being able to be responsive to needs kind of quickly, rather than, Sylvia mentioned before, teachers are under a lot of pressure and they're not social workers, but quite often they are the front line with families. They're the ones that are responding to, quite often, safeguarding concerns or just kind of problems within families. So having a social worker there that could, quickly respond to those needs, was found to be really helpful.
It's now time for a quick break. Sign up to receive our regular newsletters and keep up to date with the latest news, publications, training, events and job vacancies. Visit CoramBAAF.org.uk/stay informed for more info. Now back to the episode.
Do you have any stories off the back of that evaluation, or maybe any stories from, your time as teaching or researching that give examples of that good collaboration, that good teamwork between social workers and teachers, and how that's made a difference?
I would say that there are a couple of examples. So the Timpson programme, which was run by Oxford University, that included 305 primary schools, centred on a multi-agency approach that involved teachers being trained on how to support children in care who were experiencing emotional distress. We recognised our own limitations and called on the knowledge of those who had more expertise than us. And I think just anecdotally, it seems to have gone well, and I've observed some of the schools have really embraced a trauma-informed approach as a consequence, as an ethos, just as part of their culture. They think nothing about it. It wasn't just a project. That's who they are now. That's the approach they adopt. They are very considerate of the children's trauma and also of the success that they're having and the excellent things the children are doing. So I think that is a good example. I would also say, in terms of my work, I did engage in an international fellowship in 2019, looking at effective literacy strategies for children in care. And on my return to England, I shared the child welfare experts, some of them who have worked in social work, their views with teachers. For example, their concern about teachers either over-diagnosing children in care with a special educational need, not recognising that the behaviour was due to them trying to process the trauma that they've experienced and miscategorising that as a special educational need, and also the concern around an underdiagnosis whereby the children had been neglected and the needs that they hadn't been pushed by their biological parents. And it then went on throughout their time in school undiagnosed, and that had affected them significantly. So both issues there's tension there. And I know that when I presented those issues to teachers in my CPD sessions, they found it to be quite enlightening. And I found that most of them committed to taking practical action afterwards to better support the children in their schools.
I think we could talk about just your research for a long time, Sylvia.
Say about the social workers in school project that we worked on in Cascade. So that one wasn't just about children in care, but actually a big part of it was about changing perceptions of social work. So I think there can be quite negative perceptions of social work, particularly in the media, and families see schools, children and families see schools quite often as a safe place where they can speak for advice. Part of it was about, whether or not social workers could benefit from being in that environment where families then could get used to a social worker and kind of proactively say where they did have, where they were struggling and get that kind of support, rather than teachers, having to take on that role of almost gatekeeper and making referrals. And the evaluation did find that schools that had a social worker based there found fewer, referrals coming through to children's services, because issues were able to be dealt with kind of within that kind of safer environment for families, within schools, and it could be kind of held at a much earlier kind of level. So I think there is something about the role of schools within communities and how families perceive schools differently to how they might perceive children's services and social workers. I think that's so valuable and something that I think schools really benefit from, kind of that kind of positive perception.
That's so interesting. I feel like we could delve deeper into everything that you've said, all the research, the evaluations, all the work that has been done, but we can link those in the resources, so if anyone is interested, you can dive deeper there. But I do find that really interesting, how bias and perception comes into things, and when you break that down and you encourage sort of communication and collaboration, you do see the results that come through there. So what I am really hearing from everything that you're saying so far is it is that communication. We need that communication between teachers and social workers, and the sort of collaborative work between them, the carers, the children. We need this multi-agency approach that we keep referring back to. I'm wondering about your opinion on policies and social work policies, and if you think there's a need for change to help teachers and social workers work together better?
I would say that there is a need, and that's partly why I think there is some potential. I know there is still a lot of discussion around the move to make care experience a protected characteristic. But when I think of even things that Lorna touched on earlier, the instability that the children often experience and how that can be compounded, especially if they are in an underperforming school, with a situation in which they are in a class in which there's a revolving door of supply teachers, and the impact of that and the acute impact on that on children who are dealing with extreme instability in their personal lives isn't being fully taken into consideration by the schools. I do think that this is where wider policy is needed. And I think, for example, if we were to look at what does care experience as a protected characteristic mean in terms of reasonable adjustments? How are we dealing with issues around the staffing of the classes that these children have and other things, just the practical elements? I would say that we would probably get more teachers at the table and senior leaders if this is something that is escalated at policy level and school-wide and local authority-wide, as the move to make care experience a protected characteristic is something that many local authorities have made widespread within their local authorities, but haven't quite ironed out in terms of what it means within their schools.
Yeah, I think to add to that, actually we have some fantastic policies that exist already and some wonderful legislation, but what we don't always have is the resources to make that a reality. Thinking about what Sylvia just said, I think the idea of making care experience a protected characteristic sounds great. I don't see that it's a negative, but I also think part of it is actually saying, well, okay, if we want kind of no detriment or discrimination towards children who are looked after within education, that's really good. But that involves putting more resources into schools to make sure they can really meet those needs. Sylvia just mentioned classroom sizes and, having, the right teaching assistants and things like that. We know there's not enough schools for all of the children. We've got, increasing pressures on resources. So partially it is about changing policies, but partially it's about just giving schools and social workers the resources that they need to actually fulfill the policies that already exist.
I absolutely echo what Lorna has said. And I think as a teacher, a really practical example is the fact that we have disability as a protected characteristic in theory, according to the law. However, in practice, teachers are often not making those reasonable adjustments. And sometimes it's because they have such a large amount of students in a certain class or in certain schools. We find due to the targets when it comes to league tables, some schools avoid taking on certain students. So then other schools are oversubscribed. They may have, let's say, I've taught before where I had around 20 students in the class, in the year 7 class, that had a disability that related to their special educational need. And then the teacher, and there may be different needs which require different changes and tailoring, a tailored approach to teaching, but the teachers also practically do not even physically have the time or have adequate support in terms of the teaching assistants. That element in terms of not just new policy, but what is the stumbling block when it comes to the existing policy. And I think that does go back to us as researchers as well, that in our research, it is important that beyond looking for new things, we also evaluate why what exists at the moment hasn't worked and what can be done within the remit of what does exist at the moment. Absolutely, Lorna. I completely agree with that point.
Yeah, and I would say sort of theoretically, children who are looked after should have a lot of extra resources in school, a lot of extra focus on them. But we know that, children are still falling behind. Looked after children, that their school outcomes are still below their peers. And I would say everyone agrees that that shouldn't happen. There's actually quite a lot of agreement around how to make sure that doesn't happen. But again, it is about resources. And when you've got overstretched public systems, these children are the ones that fall between the gaps. And quite often it's, I guess, my experience, I was a relatively high achiever at school and, I did pretty well. So no one needed to do anything extra to make sure I was kind of, doing what I could. But then, you've got other children who, were a similar level of ability to me with their families who would have been getting a lot of extra tuition and support to push them. But I think children who are looked after, who are doing okay, or even, doing pretty well, are the ones quite often that get missed because the resources aren't there to say, okay, well, what will help this child, really succeed and thrive? So you do get a focus on looked after children where there are issues, where there's, behavioural issues, where there's disruption, because teachers, have to respond to those children in the classroom. But then there's this whole other group of looked after children. And I would say also children in kinship care and children with special guardianship orders, that it's not about, behavioural issues or things like that. It's actually about what might help them do even better than they're already doing.
I absolutely echo what Lorna said. Like Lorna, I experienced an adverse childhood experience, but I was a natural high achiever, and my teachers didn't need to do anything extra. But again, I ended up going to an underperforming school, and I fell beneath the gaps there where they were trying to support the students who needed more support. And I think there is that danger that if the conversation is always centered around that, it means that we end up with a deficit model. The conversation is always around the problems, and we are not learning from the excellence and the good progress that is being made by the children within the schools. So I do echo Lorna's sentiments there.
Definitely. I mean, it is worth thinking about the individual child, what opportunities can be given to them. Each individual child, what do they need to make the most progress that they can? And like you said, the impact of teachers, thinking about how that affects when children haven't had the most stability in their, in their personal lives, when they have instability at school, when they have instability through their social workers, whether that's retention of social workers and teachers, everything can affect the progress that children can make at school. So really, really valid points that you've shared there.
Just to add as well, I think when a child's taken into care, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, that's a statement from the state that says, we think we can parent this child better than they've been parented at home. I would push people to think, okay, well, if you are employed by the state, like teachers are and social workers are, you've taken over responsibility for this child. So what is it that a parent would be doing, while a child's going through school? They would be thinking about, what subjects they liked most, like what kind of tuition they might need, or how best to push them to get the best exam results. It's not just about responding where there's a problem. Like, if you're a parent for a child, like, you take an active interest in their education, right, in a rounded way. So I say, if you're stepping in, as a parent in that way, that should be as engaged as any parent would be.
I really value that perspective, because it is, it's like you said, it's not about just exam results, it's their development as a person. Like, every child, like, what skills are they going to develop throughout school that they're going to carry on through their life? It's not just what grade they get at the end of the day, it's everything that they learn throughout that sort of adolescence that then they can take on into adulthood, which obviously teachers, social workers, everyone in their surroundings can influence that. And it's how can we help them maximize their potential, essentially. Sylvia, you've mentioned before about your work abroad and your research. Are there any examples from other countries that we can learn from, that we can bring back to the UK? Is there anything that's implemented at the moment, on an international approach, a global approach? Is there any other examples of systems or models that work that we can be taking note from?
I would say that in Washington, D.C., the USA Legal Center for Foster Care and Education had a focus group with me. They influence government policy across the whole of the United States of America and have stakeholders in different states. And they said the feedback they received was that the designated teacher program, in which a teacher took responsibility to actually spend time with a child who was in care every day when they were in school, was making a difference, and the children had given them some positive feedback. I think, which goes back to what Lorna's saying about back to basics with actually relationship building, good and rich relationship building. However, I would say that in terms of the research in England, as I mentioned, the children don't like that teacher to be the teacher of a subject that they hate. So I think if anybody was to take that idea forward, I would encourage you to give the children, any schools that are interested in that, to give the children more agency in terms of choosing the teacher that works with them. And then also having a training program for other teachers, so they're not restricted to the safeguarding lead. That's one example that I would say they've received really positive feedback on.
I suppose we could think about that as, again, going to the individual needs of the child and matching them with a teacher that can support them in that way.
Absolutely. It's that tailored approach. And I think in anything that is being done, if anybody's developing an initiative now, you are going back to a tailored approach. What are the needs of that specific child? And that's why, again, with us as researchers, we have to move away from a monolithic approach, recognizing the nuances in the experience that different schools are having, the working cultures within different schools. So I think that's why that is always the challenge for us as scholars, to always remember that everybody's different, every situation is different, and you're starting from basics. We are learning, we are the student in the situation.
And I wonder if there's something there as well that can be applied to social work. You know, if you're thinking about the individual needs of the child and you're essentially matching the teacher in that way, that could also essentially be applied to social workers and their social work support.
Yeah, definitely. And I think once a child is in care, social workers don't see them that often. And I do think, obviously, social workers still need to be very aware of what's going on for the child. But, you know, there are a whole host of people who are really, really important to children when they're in care, including their foster carers, which we've not really talked about. But actually, how foster carers and teachers work together is a really important question as well. So I think that idea of not necessarily worrying about who the professional is that's involved or who the person is who's involved for the child, but who are the most important people to that child, and like, how do we make sure they are engaged and kind of, you know, focused on, you know, the needs of that child.
I'd like to echo that. The reality is social workers are under a lot of pressure and their access to the children is often limited. And it was of note to me recently with some work I did in a continuous professional developments with professionals at Oxfordshire County Council, when another department on their youth board, who works regularly with the children in care and the children that are 13 years old, 14 years old, who said, you know, Sylvia, the points you've made about the adultification of Black girls in care is really important. We recognise our colleagues in the social work team do not have as much contact with these children, but we do, and we are actually going to take this up. So again, that holistic approach, the conversation we're having now about not centering everything around one professional, one individual in an organisation, that needs to be followed through, I think, across local authorities.
Definitely. It's about that network that can help support us. Lorna, you very nicely led on to our last question. So like you said, we've spoken about social workers and we've spoken about teachers, but not necessarily about carers, about families, about communities. So do we just want to touch on how can we work with families and communities to support the children?
One thing that's important is quite often social workers can be positioned as the bad guys, you know, by the media, but also like quite often by other professionals. So I think there is something about working with, you know, families, foster carers, children themselves, to understand that actually there's no one like bad guy profession, but actually this is about meeting children's needs and safeguarding children and making sure that they can thrive. So I think there is something about just that wider understanding of the social work role and safeguarding that I think is really important not to lose a focus on, because quite often social workers can be kind of positioned as the ones who have that specific kind of statutory legal responsibility to, you know, protect children, and teachers, you know, get to do the nice, you know, work of education or family support work as a, you know, the kind of more supportive early intervention work. But I actually think it's about working with communities to build that understanding that everyone's working towards the same goal, which is kind of helping children thrive.
I think building trust is essential to get the engagement from families and communities. And I would say that, for example, that Lorna mentioned of preventative action, preventative work, good engagement that was done that meant that situations didn't escalate, would be good examples to make parents and families more aware of, to enhance their understanding that it's not necessarily a negative outcome, long-term outcome, if we do now have a social worker involved in the conversation.
And it goes back to what you said earlier. If we can have those sort of co-facilitative sessions for teachers and social workers, you know, they're learning together, they have those touch points, they have communication, relationships already built up. That's where the trust can come in. And it is really about destigmatizing sort of the social work role and, you know, social care as a whole, I suppose. And it's sort of reframing it, and I suppose giving clarity on what a social worker does, and whether that's for children or for professionals. I suppose there's a bit of work that can be done there. So I just want to say thank you for meeting with me today. It's been a really interesting conversation, especially from my perspective. Do you have any closing comments that you'd like to share? Anything that we've touched on that you'd like to elaborate a bit more, or any messages for our members going forward?
I would say, I'm going to let Lorna have the last word, but I always end my sessions with teachers and social workers by recognising my positionality as a teacher and as an academic. If I have my academic hat on, it's not the critic that counts, it's the man in the arena. Most of you are dedicated. This is a labour of love for you. And so if somebody like me comes in and say, you've missed that part, or you could do this better, you could do that, that's not what matters. It's your dedication to the children and the fact that you're open to learning if there is room for improvement. So just bear that in mind.
Thank you for giving me the last word. I'm not sure I deserve it. I guess all I would say is that teachers are so important and schools are so important to children in care, particularly amongst all of the chaos, but also teachers are an opportunity to open up doors for looked after children. Young people who are care experienced, it's not always doom and gloom. Like, we can go on to thrive and to great things, but what we need is people to really take that interest and take that time. It doesn't have to be, a huge, arduous task. It can be as simple as, recognizing that child who, never has a pen with them because so much else is going on in their life that they never remember to pack a pen. And instead of punishing them for that, making sure you've got a stash of pens to make sure that, that child, can always come in and have a pen and be able to engage with the work. It can be really little changes, but it's a difference to children in care.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really nice way to end, putting that message out there that it's a positive approach that we need and to continue in that way. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of CoramBAAF Conversations. If you'd like to know more or listen to earlier episodes, visit corambaaf.org.uk.